mRNA vaccines, as we know, sounds very exciting, but like any other technology that we've so far covered in our episodes, it is not without its challenges. So, as expected, mRNA vaccines have their challenges too. Now, the first bigger challenge is that of trials and authorization. Now, we will take a deeper look into how medicines in general undergo trials until they can be authorized for general public use.
So what is true for COVID vaccines and is true for any medical treatment is that it needs to undergo clinical trials before being admitted to be marketed and distributed to consumers. And this in various jurisdictions. So the authorities of the respective countries judge the benefits and risks of the new treatment based on the validity and reproducibility of data on human trials before taking any decision regarding its admission. Trials do happen in several stages with increasing number of participants, and they may last for up to a decade because they are also lasting after the treatment has already been admitted to the market. They cost a total of up to billions of dollars. So the business model of pharmaceutical companies is very much planning based. Only around 10% of drugs going into the clinical trials ultimately come out of it successfully, so ultimately become approved.
So now we've talked a lot about clinical trials, and clinical trials are built up in 5 phases. And the last phase is usually conducted after a treatment has been initially approved. So let's walk through how a clinical trial and its phases look like.
There is a voluntary so-called phase 0, which is optional, and it involves human trials to check how the human body and the drug affect each other, so how the human body reacts to the drug, and also how the drug reacts to the human body.
And the next is phase 1, and here you have a small group of people, so anywhere between 20 and 80 people. They test the drug for safety as well as any potential side effects.
Phase 2 might be split in 2 subphases, phases 2A and 2B, with further participants, and they focus on efficacy and what is the ideal and required dosage in order to achieve efficacy in order for the medication to be impactful.
Now, once this has been gleaned, you come over to phase 3, where you undertake this trial on a much larger group. Now we're scaling it up to 1,000 to, in some cases, even 3,000 subjects. And you test for various factors, not just efficacy, but also maybe a comparison to existing treatments, side effects, and optimal usage.
Currently, the 2 vaccines approved in the Western world are undergoing phase 4, which lasts the longest. And this essentially means during the lifetime of the drug, testing for risks and benefits and optimal use is continued.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the newly approved COVID vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech are now in the phase of having trials with tens of thousands of people. These have been conducted, and these also include additional 8-week post-final human trials.
In the Western world, the lighthouse authorization entity is the Food and Drug Administration of the United States. The approval process of the FDA obviously influences other authorities, even though they undertake their own their own research and their own decision-making process. In Europe, we have the European Medicines Agency, and the emergency use of what FDA has done is they haven't given a full authorization to the vaccines, but actually an emergency use authorization. And this means that the product remains unapproved. Either it remains unapproved or the use of an approved product remains unapproved. Mm-hmm. So this means that we only have a temporary approval of those vaccines. And the reason that this is possible is because a material threat materializes and has been declared by the Secretary of Homeland Security, which is COVID-19 last February.
Now, to quote, a consideration of a drug for an EUA, emergency use authorization, requires a finding that it is reasonable to believe that the drug may be effective to prevent, diagnose, or treat serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions. Now, the phrase may be effective is based on a risk-benefit analysis and um, and obviously also on the totality of the scientific evidence available. So it is precisely for such a situation when you have in the case of the US, just focusing on that, a epidemic, but of course, COVID is a pandemic, where these drugs must be given emergency use to prevent lives, to thwart this very materialized threat.
And this is also the reason why this is not the first time that emergency authorization use has been issued. The first, not the first time, but one of the times was in 2009 during the swine flu pandemic for PCR tests and drug treatments versus the flu. During the COVID pandemic, this has also happened before, and it was used to pass test kits, as well as UA was given to the remdesivir drug for medication and also the hydroxychloroquine, I hope this is correct, drug. However, in that case, so in the case of hydroxychloroquine, it has been revoked in June 2020, proving that sadly UA is not 100% safety bet.
So moving on now to efficacy and adverse effects of the vaccine specifically, we know that the adverse effects of this mRNA vaccine are in many areas very similar to traditional vaccines. And these are known as reactogenicity. And these are usually triggered within people that have an autoimmune response, meaning that the body responds to its own healthy cells and tissues. And an example for this autoimmune-based disease is multiple sclerosis. So from vaccines, we know that adverse effects may include fever, or fatigue, or maybe sore arms, depending on where you inject the vaccine. Now, to counter this, the mRNA sequences in mRNA vaccines are designed to mimic the sequences produced by the host cells in the human body to not force the body to trigger such autoimmune responses.
An advantage that mRNA vaccines have over inactivated vaccines is that they do not rely on egg proteins. So if you are allergic against egg, no problem here. You won't be allergic against mRNA vaccines.
Now, we know that the efficacy of Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines are 94.5 or 95% respectively. And this is much higher than the previous test applications for mRNA vaccines. And the only explanation here is the sheer amount of resources and testing that have been invested in the creation of these vaccines.
Some of the vaccines, such as Pfizer-BioNTech's, as mentioned multiple times before, need to be stored in ultra-cold environments, which means minus 15 to minus 80 degrees. In the case of Moderna, it's minus 15 to minus 25. And you could put it inside a home freezer. With Pfizer-BioNTech, you couldn't. So that's a major challenge for logistics because you need to keep that cold. It's a costly logistics process. But also what is interesting and important is how long you can store these. And mRNA vaccines would remain stable for 30 days at temperatures between 2 and 8 degrees. What makes for the longevity differences and the temperature requirements is what outer protection is used, the LNP, and also what mRNA secondary structure is in use.
Now, another potential challenge or issue with this mRNA vaccine is social media and the misinformation regarding the vaccine's impact on the human body. And some sources falsely claim that the vaccine would alter a person's DNA. Again, we've said that this is an RNA vaccine, meaning that the genetic information is transported via an mRNA. This mRNA is not an actual virus. It is merely teaching the body how to produce the spike proteins or the little knobs on top of a virus so that the body can produce these fake antigens and then create an immune response against it. A DNA vaccine would enter the cell nucleus, and if something were to go wrong, it could impact a person's DNA, but an RNA vaccine does not even enter the nucleus. So there's no chance of it altering a person's DNA.
What would help massively against misinformation is having evidence for long-term safety, which is obviously quite hard to achieve. And it is some kind of chicken and egg problem, because if people do not want to get vaccinated, you cannot prove long-term safety. And yet many people want to wait to be vaccinated until long-term safety is proven. So that's a chicken and egg problem right there. Now on to ethical, legal, societal, and economic considerations. The whole setup of vaccination infrastructure and organization of vaccination process for a historically large number of people at once or within just a couple months includes planning, acquisition, transportation, and logistics. For instance, the cold storage of the vaccine, if that is needed, but also procurement of vaccination material, as well as training and managing healthcare professionals, and also managing their capacities, scheduling the treatment, the vaccination with the patients. As we've seen just in recent times, there were critiques against politicians because they have not ordered enough vaccine, because it was essentially a bet on which firm would first come out with a successful vaccine. And all of this is going on right now currently. And many politicians say that mistakes and procedural imperfections are to be expected because of the unprecedented nature of this adventure.
Another more societal consideration is this conflict between the freedom of individuals to choose if and when they will be vaccinated versus the economic and social benefits of having a society that has herd immunity. Some people say 60%, but of course, the higher the number of people who have immunity, the better for the society. So there's a freedom versus security debate here as well.
Yeah, and what is underlying this is that you need to not just prove that the vaccine helps the one vaccinated, but also the others, so that it also prevents the virus from spreading further. And two questions really stand out here. The first one is, who are the target groups of being vaccinated first? And obviously, risk groups and elderly are the ones that are supposed to be vaccinated first. But then the question is also, where do you make the distinction? What is risk group? What is not risk group? And we also come towards global inequality in a second. But when we talk about discrimination, the second point is, and in this week, actually, there has been some major news on this. What happens to those not being vaccinated? Do they share the same rights than those being vaccinated? And if you ask the governments of Greece and Portugal, it's not the case, because they have just placed their claims inside the EU that for traveling, they want non-vaccinated people to basically be disallowed to travel. You can see that they have some economic interest in this, because they want to open their borders for tourists, for mass tourism as soon as possible again. But that's a major concern, and not just when it comes to traveling, but also when it comes to use of both public and private infrastructure. So currently, to our knowledge, private owners of infrastructure, they could actually enforce such a rule so that non-vaccinated people couldn't enter. However, there are also debates within politics that they would issue new laws that they could prevent that from happening.
Yeah, well, we already know about Qantas, an airline that has said that they would only welcome guests, travelers, if they have if they are vaccinated. So this is definitely a source of discrimination against people who do not wish to or who have not been able to get this vaccine. But we delve into the broader topic of extending or widening global inequality, because as we know, the cold storage, the timely manner, the fact that you have to take 2 doses, it costs money, several vaccines. There's a wide price range among the different vaccines, and this obviously means that the socially and economically more well-off people will get access to these vaccines earlier, than people in developing countries. And this could widen the inequality gap.
It has already been claimed by some institutions like the United Nations that there is a major problem here, that the distribution of the vaccines to emerging countries is not really undertaken fairly, or the distribution in total is not undertaken fairly. So ethical considerations are coming into play as well. As we've already talked about, the idea that you need to order more vaccination, more vaccines, more doses than you can that you could use at the end of the day, because you need to assign a probability to which manufacturer is first, and you want to solve the problem as soon as possible. The nature of the time has been to handle large budgets, and one of those large budget items is to buy vaccines. And it has been a major concern in many countries whether or not to spend more or less on this. So what is the price tag that you assign to herd immunity?
That is a very good question. I think that is one that can't be answered. It can only be debated upon. We would like to mention that at the time of this recording, it is Friday, the 22nd January. And we know that, we've always known that technological progress speeds up, but this space is moving extremely fast. Just 2 months ago, things had not happened yet, and now we are very sure that within 1 to 2 months, the situation will look very different again. And I think one positive takeaway from this entire vaccine and global pandemic conundrum is just the amounts of human progress that we can achieve if we put aside our differences and have a global cooperation that is enabled, and you have large pools of resources that are routed effectively. It's definitely one of the better things to come from this pandemic.
Yeah, we would wish for that also in terms of other technologies and other innovation to happen.